Ma'am, who are you and what are you doing in this house?
This is my home. What seems to be the problem?
We got reports of suspicious activity. I need your ID.
On what legal basis?
Just cooperate.
Ma'am.
There is a specific kind of silence that hangs over an affluent suburban street at 7:23 in the morning. It is a silence bought with 30-year mortgages and manicured hedges. A quietude that smells of damp mulch, fresh coffee, and the implicit promise of safety. On this particular Tuesday, the silence surrounding the colonial estate on the corner was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of an espresso machine in a kitchen that gleamed with marble and stainless steel. Judge Patricia Williams stood in the center of that kitchen, the morning sun cutting through the bay windows to warm the hardwood floors. She was 52 years old, wrapped in a silk robe that whispered against her skin as she moved, a ceramic mug of dark roast cradled in her hands. In 2 hours, she would be draped in the heavy black polyester of the federal bench, presiding over the Southern District's most complex criminal hearings. She would hold the power to strip men of their freedom, to sanction government agencies, to interpret the very Constitution that binds the Republic together. But in this fragile, steaming moment, she was simply a homeowner enjoying the fruits of a 3-decade career in the trenches of American justice. She had just returned from her morning jog, a 3-mile loop through the tree-lined labyrinth of the subdivision. Her heart rate was just beginning to settle, her breathing returning to a slow, steady rhythm. She watched the steam rise from her cup, thinking about the sentencing hearing scheduled for that afternoon, mentally organizing the aggravating and mitigating factors of a wire fraud case. She felt secure, she felt established, she felt at home. She did not know that her life was being watched. Outside, beyond the heavy oak front door and the decorative wreath, the silence of the street was being prowled. A patrol cruiser idled at the curb, its engine a low, predatory rumble. Inside the vehicle sat Officer Daniel Reeves, a man whose authority was defined entirely by the badge on his chest and the gun on his hip. He had watched the woman jog past him 10 minutes earlier. He had seen the high-end athletic gear, the confident stride, the way she turned up the driveway of the most expensive house on the block without hesitation. But Officer Reeves did not see a federal judge. He did not see a former district attorney with a spotless record. Through the dirty windshield of his cruiser, filtered through layers of ingrained bias and cynical assumptions, he saw only an anomaly. He saw a black woman in a neighborhood where he believed she did not belong. The cognitive dissonance scratched at the back of his mind, an itch that demanded a scratch. It didn't matter that she had a key. It didn't matter that she waved to the neighbor walking a golden retriever. To him, her presence was a question mark that needed to be straightened into an exclamation point. He reached for his radio. The lie came easily to his lips, practiced and smooth. He called for backup, fabricating a report of a suspicious person, a phantom caller who had never dialed 911, a ghost witness who had allegedly seen someone casing the property. It was a fiction born of prejudice, a routine abuse of power that had worked for him a dozen times before. He had no idea that this specific lie would cost the city millions of dollars. He had no idea that the radio waves carrying his voice were initiating a chain reaction that would reach the halls of Congress. Beside him, or arriving shortly after, was Officer Marcus Thompson. They were the hunters, or so they thought, converging on prey they assumed was defenseless. They stepped out of their vehicles, the heavy thud of boots on pavement signaling the end of the morning's peace. They adjusted their belts, the leather creaking, resting their hands near their holsters in a posture of aggressive readiness. They walked up the driveway, past the flower beds Judge Williams had planted with her own hands the previous weekend, and ascended the porch steps. Inside, the first heavy knock echoed through the foyer like a gunshot. Judge Williams froze. The coffee mug paused halfway to her lips. This was not the polite rap of a delivery driver, or the friendly knock of a neighbor returning a borrowed tool. This was a demand. It was a sound that claimed authority over the wood it struck. She set the mug down. The steam continued to rise, undisturbed, as she tightened the sash of her robe. She walked toward the door, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. Confusion was her primary emotion, a mild intellectual curiosity about who would be pounding on her door before the school buses had even finished their rounds. She checked the peephole. The distorted fisheye view revealed the uniforms, the grim expressions, the aggressive stances. For a brief second, her legal mind flashed through possibilities. Was there an emergency in the neighborhood? Had something happened to a family member? She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, expecting to be met with information. Instead, she was met with an interrogation. The morning air rushed in, cool and crisp, but the temperature on the porch was instantly scorching. Officer Reeves did not offer a greeting. He did not apologize for the disturbance. He simply loomed, a wall of blue nylon and hostility, and demanded to know who she was and what she was doing in the structure standing behind her. The question hung in the air, absurd and insulting. Judge Williams looked at the man. She saw the sneer he couldn't quite hide, the way his eyes darted over her shoulder to scan the interior of her foyer, the way he looked at her silk robe not as loungewear, but as evidence of vagrancy or vice. She felt the sudden, cold realization wash over her. They didn't know. They had no idea they were standing on the doorstep of a woman who signed their search warrants. In that heartbeat, the power dynamic shifted, though only one person knew it. Officer Reeves thought he was cornering a trespasser. He thought he was squeezing a suspect. He didn't realize he was poking a sleeping dragon with a very short stick. She answered him with a question of her own, her voice calm, modulated to the perfect pitch of a courtroom veteran. She stated that this was her home. She asked with genuine perplexity what the problem seemed to be, but the officer wasn't interested in dialogue. He was interested in submission. He ignored her assertion of ownership. He barked a command for identification, his voice rising, treating her calm demeanor as insolence. He demanded papers in her own doorway, requiring her to prove her right to exist in her own space. When she asked him what legal basis he was making these demands, the atmosphere on the porch curdled. To these men, a citizen citing the law was not exercising a right. They were offering a challenge. Thompson stepped forward, closing the distance, adding his physical bulk to the intimidation. They spoke of reports, of suspicious activity, of people who didn't fit the profile of the neighborhood. They were digging their own graves with every word, and the tiny red light on their body cameras blinked silently, recording every shovelful of dirt. Judge Williams looked at them, really looked at them, and made a decision. She would not tell them who she was, not yet. She would let them show her exactly who they were. She would let the rope play out until there was enough to hang them with. She stood in the threshold, a woman in a bathrobe facing two armed agents of the state, and prepared to teach them a lesson in constitutional law that would destroy their lives. The coffee in the kitchen was still hot. The morning was still young. But the war had just begun. The morning air, usually filled with the chirping of cardinals and the distant hum of suburban traffic, now vibrated with a frequency that every Black American knows in their marrow. It is the frequency of imminent danger disguised as public safety. Judge Patricia Williams stood her ground. She did not retreat into the foyer, nor did she step out onto the porch to meet them on their terms. She remained framed in the doorway, a tableau of domestic tranquility interrupted by the heavy metallic presence of state power. Officer Reeves was not accustomed to resistance, certainly not from women in silk robes, and absolutely not from women who looked like Patricia Williams. To him, her questions were not inquiries, they were insults. He repeated his demand for identification, his hand resting casually, terrifyingly, near the service weapon on his hip. He wasn't asking for a driver's license. He was asking for her submission. He wanted her to acknowledge that his badge gave him the right to suspend her reality. When Judge Williams calmly inquired about the specific probable cause that brought them to her doorstep, Reeves's patience evaporated like mist. He didn't have a legal basis, and they both knew it. He had an impulse, a prejudice, and a badge, and for years, that had been enough. Thompson stepped in then, playing the heavy to Reeves's aggressor. He spun a fiction about reports of suspicious activity, a phantom call about a woman who didn't belong. The lie hung in the air, heavy and rancid. There was no report. There was no caller. There was only a Black woman in a neighborhood that Reeves felt, in his deep, unexamined bias, should have been beyond her reach. They couldn't articulate what she had done because her crime was simply existing in a zip code that defied their expectations. And then, the threshold was crossed. This is the moment where the abstract concept of liberty bleeds into the physical reality of violation. Without a warrant, without consent, and without emergency circumstances, Officer Reeves pushed past the homeowner. The sound of heavy police boots on the polished hardwood of her entryway was a desecration. It was the sound of the Fourth Amendment shattering on the floorboards. Thompson followed, a silent accomplice to the breaking of the law he was sworn to uphold. Judge Williams did not scream. She did not physically resist. She knew that to raise her hand, even in defense of her own sanctuary, would be to sign her own death warrant. Instead, she reached for the only weapon allowed to her in that moment, her smartphone. The camera lens is the modern eye of God. It sees without blinking, remembers without bias. As she raised the device to document the intrusion, Reeves exploded. The presence of the camera stripped away the veneer of professional policing. He didn't see a citizen documenting a grievance. He saw a target fighting back. He lunged. The footage, stored safely in the cloud the moment it was captured, would later show the violence of his motion. He snatched the phone from her hand, the device clattering across the room, sliding under the antique console table. He barked that she was obstructing justice, a cruel irony considering he was the one actively dismantling it. They were now standing in her living room, surrounded by her books, her art, the quiet evidence of a life built on intellect and hard work, and they treated it all like a crime scene. But the silence of the phone didn't stop the recording. High in the corners of the room, the silent sentinels of her home security system were watching. They captured the heat, the aggression, and then the descent into something far darker. With the phone gone, the officers felt untethered. They began to search. They opened drawers. They rifled through personal papers. They were looking for the drugs, the weapons, the evidence of illegality that their worldview insisted must be there. A woman like this, in a house like this, in their minds, it had to be ill-gotten. The cognitive dissonance was too great for them to process otherwise. And as they searched, the mask slipped completely. Reeves began to speak, not as an officer of the law, but as a man consumed by resentment. The words that spilled from his mouth were not procedural commands. They were slurs, ancient, ugly words that have been used to dehumanize and destroy for centuries. He commented on the furniture, sneering that it was too nice for someone of her kind. He speculated, with a vulgarity that would later make jurors retch, about how she afforded the mortgage. Was it drugs? Was it the sale of her own body? Thompson joined in, a chorus to the hate. They stripped her of her dignity with every sentence, reducing a federal judge, a legal scholar, a pillar of the community, to a stereotype. They weaponized their ignorance. They stood in the center of her achievements and defecated on them with their words. Judge Williams stood by the fireplace, her heart hammering against her ribs. But her face a mask of stone. She was terrified. Any human being would be. But beneath the fear was a cold, hard rage. She was memorizing them. She was cataloging every slur, every illegal search of a drawer, every violation of protocol. She was building a case file in her mind, organizing the counts of the indictment before the crime was even finished. For 20 minutes, they tormented her. They tried to provoke a reaction, a shout, a tear, anything that would justify the handcuffs they were itching to use. They wanted her to break. They wanted her to confirm their bias that she was volatile, dangerous, suspicious. But she gave them nothing. She gave them only the terrifying silence of a storm gathering on the horizon. Finally, having found nothing but coasters and correspondence, Reeves turned to leave. But he couldn't resist one final twist of the knife. He leaned in, invading her personal space, his breath sour with coffee and malice. He warned her. He told her that if he saw her in this neighborhood again, her neighborhood, her streets, he would arrest her for trespassing. He threatened to contact the actual homeowner, promising to expose her attempt to squat in a house that clearly didn't belong to her. He thought he was delivering a closing argument. He thought he was asserting dominance. He had no idea he was delivering the opening statement of his own destruction. Judge Williams looked at him, really looked at him, her eyes tracing the badge number on his chest, the nameplate that would soon be infamous. She walked slowly to the coffee table, where her purse sat. The officers watched, hands drifting to their belts, expecting a weapon. What she pulled out was far more dangerous than a gun. She retrieved a small leather wallet. She flipped it open. The gold badge of the federal district court caught the morning light, gleaming with a brilliance that seemed to scorch the air in the room. She placed it gently on the table between them. the silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a vacuum, the sudden, violent absence of air in the room. It was the sound of two men realizing, in a single, heart-stopping second, that they had not been hunting a gazelle. They had walked into the den of a lioness, and the door had just locked behind them. Have you ever watched a man's soul leave his body? Have you ever seen the exact moment when a bully realizes the playground has vanished and he is standing on the edge of a cliff? Reeves looked at the credentials. He looked at the woman he had just called a whore. He looked at the badge that outranked him by a magnitude of power he couldn't comprehend. His face drained of color, turning the texture of wet ash. Thompson began to back away, a primal instinct to flee taking over his motor functions. The conflict was over. The slaughter was about to begin. The air in the room didn't just change, it crystallized. It became a solid, suffocating weight that pressed against the lungs of Officer Reeves and Officer Thompson. The gold badge on the coffee table wasn't merely a piece of metal. It was a radioactive core, pulsing with an authority that these two men had spent their entire careers pretending to uphold, yet clearly never understood. For 20 seconds, the only sound in that colonial hallway was the hum of the refrigerator and the ragged, shallow breathing of two men watching their futures disintegrate. Judge Williams did not scream. She did not flip tables or launch into a tirade. She simply stood there, wrapped in silk, radiating the kind of freezing calm that exists only in the eye of a hurricane. She watched the realization bleed into their faces. It started in the eyes, a widening, a sudden loss of focus, and traveled down to their hands, which twitched uselessly at their sides. The adrenaline that had fueled their aggression just moments ago turned sour in their veins, curdling into a nauseating cocktail of panic and dread. Reeves, the man who had been so vocal, so full of bluster and venom about who belonged where, found his throat had seized. He tried to speak, perhaps to stammer an apology, perhaps to claim it was all a misunderstanding, but the words died on his tongue. There are no words for a mistake of this magnitude. There is no protocol for realizing you have just committed a federal felony against the very person who signs your search warrants. They retreated. It wasn't a tactical withdrawal. It was a clumsy, desperate flight. They backed toward the door, boots scuffing on the hardwood they had violated, eyes fixed on that badge as if looking away would cause it to detonate. They stumbled over the threshold, practically falling onto the porch, the sunlight outside feeling less like a new day and more like an interrogation lamp. But as they scrambled into their cruiser, tires screeching against the asphalt of the driveway they had no right to be in, they were already too late. The trap hadn't just been sprung, the cage had already been welded shut. Inside the house, Judge Williams didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She moved with the precision of a surgeon preparing to cut out a tumor. She picked up her phone, the one Reeves had thrown, the screen cracked but the processor still humming, and she didn't call 911. She dialed a number that bypasses the dispatchers, bypasses the local precinct, and rings directly in the offices of the Department of Justice. She was calling in the cavalry, but not the kind with sirens, the kind with subpoenas. Within 30 minutes, the dynamic of that suburban street shifted from a local disturbance to a federal crime scene. The arrival of the FBI is distinct. There is no bluster, no shouting, no aggressive posturing. It is the arrival of suits, of briefcases, of quiet, terrifying competence. Special Agent Maria Santos, a veteran of the Civil Rights Division, stepped onto the porch. She didn't look at the flower beds. She looked at the camera angles. She saw the geometry of the violation. When the technical specialists pulled the footage from the cloud, the room fell silent again. This wasn't grainy CCTV footage from a gas station. This was high-definition, audio-perfect cinema. Every slur, every threat, every illegal step was captured in 4K resolution. The prosecutor, David Chen, a man who had spent 15 years hunting corruption, watched the monitor and shook his head. He wasn't looking at a police error. He was looking at a confession. The evidence was so clear, so undeniable, it felt less like an investigation and more like an autopsy. Meanwhile, across town, in the safety of their precinct, Reeves and Thompson were trying to stop the hemorrhaging. They sat in the break room, hands shaking, scrolling through a phone, typing in the name Patricia Williams. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to read your own obituary while you are still alive? The search results loaded. The blood left their faces. She wasn't just a federal judge. She was the chief judge. She was the woman who oversaw the entire district. She was the jurist who had sentenced corrupt mayors and dismantled organized crime rings. She was the absolute apex predator of the legal ecosystem, and they had walked into her home and treated her like a criminal. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just going to be fired, they were going to be hunted. They had handed the federal government the perfect weapon to destroy them, wrapped in a bow of racial slurs and unconstitutional entry. Reeves called in sick, his voice trembling. Thompson tried to request emergency leave. They were like children trying to hide under the covers to escape a house fire. They hired lawyers they couldn't afford, desperate men making desperate calls, but the silence on the other end of the line was telling. Even defense attorneys know when a case is radioactive. By Thursday, the levees broke. Judge Williams authorized the release of the footage. It didn't just hit the local news, it detonated across the national consciousness. The video played on every cable network, looped on every social media feed. 25 million views, 25 million witnesses to the arrogance, the hate, the sheer stupidity of unchecked power. The nation watched Officer Reeves snarl at a woman in her own living room. They watched Thompson rummage through her personal effects. And then, they watched the pivot the moment the badge hit the table. The public reaction was visceral. It wasn't just anger, it was a collective gasp of vindication. For every person who had ever been stopped, questioned, or harassed without the power to fight back, Judge Williams became an avatar of justice. She was the sword and the shield. The police chief's press conference was a study in damage control, a man trying to hold back a tsunami with a paper umbrella. He spoke of suspensions and investigations. But his eyes betrayed him. He knew, everyone knew, the department wasn't investigating an incident anymore. They were fighting for their survival. Because the FBI didn't just want the two officers. They wanted the files. They wanted the emails. They wanted the history. They smelled the rot in the floorboards, and they were bringing the sledgehammers. Judge Williams sat in her home office, the same room where she had retrieved her credentials, and watched the news coverage. She saw the pundits arguing, the police union representatives stammering, the world reacting to the violation of her sanctuary. She took a sip of tea, her hand steady, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The officers had wanted a war. They had wanted to question her authority. She was about to give them an answer they would hear for the rest of their lives. The pivot was over. The legal war was about to begin, and she had brought an army.